Hi, Rex here at RW Mods. Today we're going to look at this. It's an OS Speed. This is the OS Speed B21 Ty2. It's the Ty Tessman head one. And we'll open the box up here. This was sent to me by the owner, so it might be missing a manual or something too. But this is the packaging they come with. The pretty common bubble that those come in. So as you can see, this is the low head version. They also have a tall, kind of a standard head version. It's a pretty nice looking engine. I always think the low heads look pretty cool. They look a little bit odd in the car though. Maybe if some bodies get developed and stuff to make them not look quite so weird. They usually kind of look like someone, did an e-buggy with a, from a distance, an e-buggy, with the nitro body on it or something, because you can't really see the engine in there. Now this engine I think normally sells for 450 to 470 area, which is pretty standard for a lot of the OS speeds. This one I did see, I think this person got it on sale for around $375, so that's a pretty good deal for an OS speed. This is a 16.4 by 16.4, so basically a square bore and stroke engine. And this is basically very similar to the B2101, B2102 engines. We'll get into it. I think I did, there's maybe some slight modifications to it, but for the most part, based off the B2101, which is a square bore and stroke. On the website said this is, it's the 21J3 carb. So it says 21J on the carb, which is I'm not sure what the third version of the 21J. They probably made a couple little small tweaks. I noticed some of the newer speeds had different carb pull here, where you had a set screw on each side where you could actually orientate it better. You didn't have to worry about the set screw being in the so you could get at it to adjust your carb pull. This person did message me before they sent it to me and asked about the crank play. They said they just got this engine and it had a lot of crank play, and if you can see, it's a good amount. Let's measure it. Let's see how much. See if we can measure it. So we have it out. Let's see. Look like almost close to a millimeter. Kind of hard to do because it moves right away. It's hard. It's hard to measure because it's it's just being pulled out, but it does look like maybe at least a half a millimeter to closer to a millimeter of play, which I'll look at that later. I do when I get an engine in for modifying and it's excessive, I do sometimes address that. It's a little bit tricky. You have to actually take material off the lip of the back plate, and it changes your case volume too, your volume of your air in the case, the fuel mixture. So that's about it on the outside. Just looking at things, like I said, I always thought the low engines, I mean, especially looking like this, they look really cool. And I think performance-wise, I've never ran one personally in a car. I haven't been racing a lot lately, and I've heard they run a little warmer, which on an OS can be. You have to be careful because you get an OS hot, they typically will lose some of their pinch. So just be mindful not to get it too hot. Might end up running just a tad bit richer with this head, but I get the low CG. Let's just take a, I don't know, I got an engine sitting here. I mean, you got quite a bit of CG difference, so it's lower in the car, which on some tracks, actually, some tracks having a little higher head might be better on a little low bite situation, and this would be better on like a grooved high bite situation where it's not gonna, your car's not gonna roll as much. So we'll take this thing apart here. I don't have my tool here. My tool's at the shop. But if you're a drone pilot, if you bend the end of a propeller, it works really good. It's a nice wide area to take the sleeve out. Now this sleeve is a little bit stubborn. It's a little bit tight in there. Usually they come out new a little bit better than that. So I'd asked the owner too that if this had an oil bath break-in because it had kind of a different thinner oil in it, and he said he had put some what do you say, 3-in-1 oil in it, so I'm not quite sure why. They usually come oiled pretty good. And on these with the DLC coated crank and aluminum piston and brass sleeve, there really isn't a whole lot in them that can rust. The bearing races and wristband, I suppose, but not a whole lot that can rust. So the block is pretty much up to par with the newer OS stuff. It's got some engraving underneath there. It's kind of neat. Something you'll never see once the engine mounts on. But ceramic bearing in it. Well, I don't think the back is, but in the OS, the blue sealed OS bearings are generally one of the better bearings. They have a really nice thick lip seal on them. They seem to seal nice and they last pretty good, keep the dirt out. So we'll look at the crank here. Silicone filled, DLC coated. Pretty much all you'd really want in a crank. I think some of the other engines, maybe the B2101, I'd have to see for sure, but I know like the Drake has 2 tungsten weights. Probably not a difference you're going to feel in the car. Maybe it might change the way it feels at RPM, at like high RPM or something. The piston, I don't know if I haven't taken an OS piston apart recently, or if they changed something, because you kind of notice the difference in color between the very top and the very bottom, and this is a grind finish. I believe that's the only difference there, but they maybe changed some of their either piston material or piston machining process, because it looks a little different than what I'm used to, but I haven't really taken a new one apart lately either, so they kind of look a lot different once they're used. So this is the 29.5mm rod with the dimple in it. The sleeve, we got a 3-port sleeve. Looks a lot like many of the engine lines that OS has. The bore is a little different than like your Spec 2 and stuff. The Spec 2 was like a 16.28 bore, longer stroke. I did notice when I was taking this apart, there was a little bit of a catch. I could feel just a little bit of a catch when I was taking it apart. I'll have to do a little diamond filing on the ports. Generally something you don't have to do on an OS. Head button, I want to say some of the newer ones have a little bit smaller dimple. So this one being, if it is a little bit bigger dimple, it's hard to tell, you know, unless they're side by side, but I didn't like some of the smaller dimples on some of the newer engines, so this is a pretty good looking head button. They always put different kind of grooves in there. I think that signifies that it's different than some of the other engines, or maybe, you know, the compression height or whatever. I was going to see. Okay, there's two shims there. I didn't know if there was two shims. Generally, OS come with one aluminum and one brass shim. And I did measure piston to head clearance, so that's with the piston at TDC and your clearance between there. And I was getting like 22 thousandths. To me, that's a little bit tighter than what OS used to run. Personally, I think if you have one of these, or you try it adding a 4,000 shim. I think you'll like the way it tunes better, but depends on how you run it. If it's a lot of high speed, with the higher compression, it will rev a little bit quicker off the bottom. Maybe just on the box it'll feel snappier, but that doesn't mean anything, for power wise. Generally, that's one of the reasons why I don't like it when people run this is an Os Speed 3 plug, which is pretty standard. Guys run an Os Speed 3 in a Novarossi engine, and Novarossis use like a number 6 or pretty cold plug because they have the higher compression in the colder plug, so the higher compression helps it fire a little bit better. They put a super hot plug like a P3 in there, and then you'll get detonation. You'll get some pitting in the top of your piston from it'll actually fire before it gets to the top, and actually work against itself and stuff. So that's one thing. Head shimming. I got a video on head shimming. If you look that up, if you're a little bit curious about that. So there's something to play with. Like you can run a P3 plug in a Novarossi, but I'd recommend adding a shim. No, okay, he must have taken the carb restrictor out. This carb, I do like the regular standard 21J that's been out for years. Had the kind of more tan or clearish looking carb isolation, the heat isolation. And I do like the new ones where they have this. It appears to be plastic, maybe a Delrin type material. It's got an O-ring at the top, but I like that it kind of extends past, so it's not touching. So the metal of the block isn't touching the metal of the carb, so it doesn't heat soak the carb and get the carb hot and possibly boil the fuel. That's kind of when you have trouble sometimes refiring an engine after it's been ran. But the older OS used to have a little washer. I don't even know what it was made out of. It was plastic or whatever that sit down in there, and then some guys would lose them or whatever. Although they don't really have, it's a nice fit. Well, it's a little bit. So all your sealing is from this O-ring. So some engines have, dang flies in the shop. Some engines have an O-ring down in there. This one does not. So yeah, pretty good tuning engine. When you're tuning an OS, I like about a 0.5 millimeter to 20 to 30 thousandths. 30 thousandths being on the higher side, probably closer to 20 thousandths or 0.5 millimeter idle gap. And you check that with I don't have something around, but basically you stick something 0.5 millimeter down in that gap to kind of get it. Or if you've done enough of them, you can kind of tell by looking at it. But just with all engines, you want to make sure you set that idle gap. This looks actually pretty close right there. 3-needle carb. Very few people touch the mid needle. I recommend, unless you know what you're doing, to leave it alone. Look at the head here. The engraving is nice. I mean, well, it's probably more of a screen print on there. I kind of like the sandblast finish. It's pretty low CG head, but it's not a lot of material there. So I guess if I was spending $375 on it, personally for myself, I would probably go with the taller head. Although I like the look of this lower head, but I think it's gonna run a little more consistent for you probably. Just make sure you got a lot of airflow. Your body's not covering where it is, and maybe you have a low, a body with the low back on it or whatever. So make sure you're getting a lot of air. Maybe cut the window out so some air goes through the window. So work on that. I don't know. That's my feeling, but I haven't ran one back to back to see how the temperature difference is. That's just my feeling. So if you have experience with it, you could always pick up a used head. I think most OS engine heads will fit, and you could try both and see which one you like or whatever. So all in all, for this reduced price, $375 is actually a pretty good price. I always kind of had trouble spending that much on $450 on one. So we got the Os Speed Ty2. Like I said, it's a 16.4 by 16.4, so it's a 16.4 bore, 16.4 stroke, which is what they call a square stroke engine. Below down is actually 47. That's a little bit. That's the difference I was getting on the between the B2101 I currently had in the program. That was more down 43, so a little more blowdown. That's the difference between the intake port and the exhaust port. So that's kind of your difference between the two. So raising the exhaust port gives you more blowdown, higher blowdown number, and more top end generally. So this engine might have a little more top end than the B2101. I don't know if it's just a run change in production, because this is a newer engine. The one I had might have been 2-3 years ago, so might have been just a running production. I can't tell if it's a difference between this one and the OS, the B2101. Induction open and closing was all pretty close to what the other one I had in there, for a total of 220. So induction open is 150, induction closing is 70, and a total of 220. So now that's in the block. Your induction opening is when your crank's spinning in the dang flies. I killed a couple before I started the video. It's fly season, I guess. So that's when your crank window opens to let air in from the carburetor into the crankcase. So that's 150 degrees on the open, and then 70 degrees on the closing. And the B21 typically, I haven't really ran much a whole lot, but I've had guys send them to me for modifying because they want to get more bottom end out of this engine. Not really a truggy engine. I've had people ask too, like, what's the difference between a buggy and a truggy engine? Basically, you want a lot of bottom end power for a truggy to pull it, a short run up jump or getting off the corner. They're heavier and such. So it just depends on the timing and the design and everything. So this, I think on the B2101, the bore and stroke's different. But I think the biggest difference is induction closing is always pretty high on there, where some of the other longer stroke OSs might be in the lower 60s there, with the induction opening being pretty close. So I've always kind of recommended the B2101 style engine for more of a buggy. I have heard of guys running them in a truggy, and it depends on your track. You might have a fast-flowing track in a truggy. If you don't have a lot of short run-up stuff or getting off the corner or low traction, might actually help you on a low traction track. That's kind of it on the B20, or let's call it the OS, a B21 Ty2. So. That's about it on this. So, it's one thing I forgot. I said I was going to talk about the backplate, and so the backplate's in there. It's basically the thing that's holding the the rod on the crank. So you got the back plates here, and you have a little bit of play, right? So say you have a little bit of play, so the crank, so it's not uptight. Now you don't want it tight there, but and then when the clutch is on, it's always pulling. The clutch is on, it's pulling the crank. So you're basically your bearing is being sandwiched. It's pulling up against your bearing. So the crank is not gonna the crank's not gonna pull forward and hit the back plate. But you have a little bit of a gap there, and I have seen engines where they kind of the rod tends to ride just a little bit out. You have a little bit of less surface area on that also. So the rod it's possible for the rod to run a little bit out when you have a little bit more of a backplate play. So I like to, and I don't charge extra when I'm modifying an engine to address this issue, and I'll chuck it up in a lathe, and I'll take some material off of this surface to just sit in there a little bit farther, and it's not too bad to set up and do that, and it does help with a little bit of case volume too, like just the smaller volume I have in here, the more direct. When the piston goes down, it's a little more direct, a little more force going up, the air going up into the cylinder. So, and it also takes away, sometimes it's a little bit smoother engine if they have a more case volume. So it does look like they maybe possibly changed this O-ring. That's one of my pet peeves with OS was they always were, especially on a used engine, the backplate O-ring wasn't quite tight enough. This one actually feels pretty good. We'll see over time if they've addressed that. But one thing I thought it was a pretty simple fix if they went just a couple thousandths or 2 to 5 thousandths less on that groove, just to make it a little bit snugger with that O-ring. Like I said, this one feels pretty good, so should be a good engine. We're going to modify this one up for the guy and get her out to him this week. So thanks for watching. This is RW Mods.